and welcome to Legislative Report. I'm State Representative Mark Gillen, serving the people of the 128th Legislative District in Berks County. This month, I want to focus on an age-old tradition of serving the public and keeping it safe. I'm speaking of our volunteer fire companies and those who donate their time to make them work. I'm privileged to have as my guest Pennsylvania's Fire Commissioner, Ed Mann. Ed, welcome.
Morning, Representative. Nice to be here.
Thank you for your service to the Commonwealth. And I'm imagining there's some folks out there that probably would like to learn a little bit more about you, how you came into this role, where you came from, and what your background is.
I retired from the Air Force in 1994 as a firefighter and found work with a state senator in my home district of Center County. And eventually the state fire commissioner's job became open and I applied for it. And I interviewed with then Lieutenant Governor Mark Schweiker on 4 different occasions. And after a month or so after the last interview, I got a phone call saying, do you want to be the fire commissioner? And I've been serving in this capacity then for the last 12 years.
You're obviously enjoying yourself. You travel a lot. It's hard work. Talk about Marcellus for a minute. How has that changed your job? Obviously, it's made you busier.
Well, it's created some additional challenges for volunteer emergency responders in those areas where there's drilling going on, more so related to vehicle accidents than anything else, just because of the increased volume in traffic. Most of the responses to gas well sites have been because of trips, falls, crush injuries, those types of things. So there's really been nothing really significant as far as a big incident,
right?
Major incidents. It's been just related to industrial type stuff, but it has caused an increase in call volume.
Let's use the mention of volunteers as a segue here. It's created some additional pressures on volunteers. Is it fair to say that with the training and the introduction of Marcellus shale industry to Pennsylvania?
It has, and it has for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, we have some new training we've got to get out to the first responders, so that's an additional time, that we're asking for volunteers to provide. The other thing is a lot of the volunteers have gone to work for the gas industry. And because they're working for the gas industry, they're working long hours, and they really don't have the time left to give to the volunteer fire department as a result of that.
The communities that I represent rely heavily on volunteer fire departments, and I've looked at statistics, heard some information about the declension in the number of volunteers. Is that a phenomena that's statewide? How widespread is it?
If you consider in the mid-'70s, there was a report done called Pennsylvania Burning. The numbers were estimated to be close to 300,000. In the late 90s, another study had been done, and it was estimated the numbers were closer to 70,000. In my travels across the state, I honestly think we're somewhere between 55 and 60,000 today, which is a significant decline over what we had in the late 70s.
As a legislator, looking at this through the window of fiscal responsibility and stewardship, it strikes me that we have an enormous debt that we owe these volunteers, both by virtue of their sacrifice, but also the savings that accrues to the Commonwealth because we don't have a professional, full-time, paid fire department. How long can this go on? And is my assessment correct with regard to the savings being enormous? I have used the figure billions of dollars.
Well, it is billions of dollars, and I think it would be difficult to put a specific number on it, but it is billions of dollars. And it's not only a problem that Pennsylvania is experiencing, it's a problem that's being experienced nationwide. I think it's more significant in Pennsylvania just by the virtue of the total number of volunteer fire departments we have in Pennsylvania. When you consider that 95% of the land mass in Pennsylvania is protected by volunteer fire departments and volunteer firefighters, that's pretty significant.
How do we compare Pennsylvania and what we're doing to other states? It's a very rural state, but when I consider the seat that you're sitting in, you're dealing with high rises in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. You have to look at the Marcellus, barns and rural structures in rural Pennsylvania. And the impression that I get, this must be a significant challenge when you consider the diversity of firefighting in Pennsylvania.
Well, the diversity of the geography in Pennsylvania, the diversity of the citizens, causes even greater diversity with the fire departments. And that's one of the issues we grapple with at times when you try to find a solution to the problem. What might work in northeastern Pennsylvania won't work in southeastern Pennsylvania. I recently testified at a hearing in western Pennsylvania. It was aired on PCN, and I got an email from a gentleman in eastern Pennsylvania who said there wasn't enough training, and I got an email from a gentleman in western Pennsylvania who said there was too much training. So trying to find a happy medium to help solve those issues is difficult.
I think it's fair to assess there's significant cultural, regional differences in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that we've all observed. With regard to regionalization of services, has that accelerated in recent years?
I would say in the last 2 years, from where I sit, there's been a great deal more activity in the last 2 years towards consolidations and mergers than there had been in the previous 10 years. And it's being driven by the fire service. It's the fire service that has recognized that in order to survive, they need to consolidate or merge. At the end of the day, it's a local decision. I don't think the Commonwealth will ever force the issue, but at the end of the day, it's a local decision, and I think the Commonwealth needs to do what it can to help move that process along when the locals have decided that that's the route they want to go.
We've looked macro, if you will. Let's look micro, a little closer to home. As a husband, as a dad of 4 children, what are some practical help, some consideration for the homeowner with regard to keeping their residents safe?
If you have small children, one of the best things you can do is do regular fire drills in your home. Have an exit plan with your family, so the family knows. Teach your children how to stay low, how keep their doors closed. Pay attention to the smoke detectors. A meeting place on the outside of the building the outside of the home is very important, but you have to practice it. Drawing it down on a piece of paper doesn't get it. You've got to practice it.
Right, and that's the challenge for each individual parent, to make the time, the place, dedicate themselves to it. I've got a 4-year-old, and I would imagine that this is going to have to take place repeatedly as time goes on, and then instructionally, the older children perhaps shepherding the younger children if the parents aren't around.
Absolutely, and don't hesitate to reach out to your local fire department to get the expertise or some advice that you might need in order to come up with your plan.
We feel very fortunate that we have tremendous local volunteer firefighters, and they have been out in the public, and I don't know the exact name for this smoke-filled room, if you will. It's a kind of theater fog, and they went inside there, and it was a tiny place, and so I was only able to look in briefly, but it appeared to me there was a set of stairs and simulation that would reflect what it would feel like, at least in part, if there was a structural fire that they were involved with.
The fire safety prevention trailers, and it's an excellent tool to use to help children to understand what they're going to be faced with. If I could go back to one thing, it's important that we have folks who want to volunteer as firefighters. But I think one thing that the community needs to understand is that a lot of our volunteer fire departments may not always need firefighters. Maybe you're a local citizen that has some expertise with finances. Maybe you could step up to volunteer to be the financial secretary or help with fundraising at the fire department to lessen the burden of the firefighters actually having to do the fundraising and that administrative work, so they could focus more on training and actual response to emergencies.
It's an exceptional point. You don't have to don the air pack. You don't have to be behind the wheel of the engine. There's a lot of support roles out there for people to perform.
Absolutely.
And I'm imagining, and you touched on it, with all the multitasking that's going on here, we'll probably end up with a volunteer in a more enduring situation with the air pack or fighting the fires if he knows he doesn't have to be selling the chicken barbecue all the time.
When I started in the fire service in the 70s in Center County, we had 35 or 40 people active with the fire crew. So when I had to work bingo, I only had to work it like once every other month. Now when you're trying to do that same work with only 15 or 20 people, those 15 or 20 people are there for every fundraising event. And now On top of that, I'm going to say, well, now you've got to come for training, and then we're going to throw a couple emergencies into the middle of this, and then I need you back here on Saturday to help with a car wash or a chicken barbecue. And it's just getting to be too much for the fewer number of people that we have today.
Well, these are some excellent points. We're going to close here. As we wind down, it reminds me, and perhaps it would be a good reminder for our viewers, that whether you eat chicken or not, and whether your car is dirty, and whether you like bingo, show up at these events and support our local volunteers.
Absolutely, Representative.
Thank you very much,
Thank you for your time today.
I appreciate it. At the beginning of the program, I talked about the age-old tradition of volunteer firefighting in Pennsylvania. Recently, I paid a visit to one of my constituents who, in his own way, is helping to keep the distant memories of this tradition alive. Let's meet John Fleming of Scarlett's Mill. I am pleased today to be with my good friend John Fleming in Scarlett's Mill in Robinson Township in Berks County. And we're standing next to his pride and joy, a 1916 fire truck. In a couple minutes, we're going to share some of the details of that fire truck. But first I'm going to ask John to describe a little bit about where we're at, maybe even the history. Scarlett's Mill, where did that name come from? What does it mean?
Scarlett's Mill was from the settlers here, and they built the mill and housing, and there was lots of different businesses here. And the Scarletts were very famous for helping the Underground Railroad. There's some of the buildings, even we can have tunnels that they show where they hid a lot of the slaves.
So actually some tunnels still in this area that exist.
That's correct, yes.
It's got a wonderful history. And the mill itself, portion of that refers to a building, a prior business?
The structure of the building is a house now, but it was original mill with way they hoisted grain up with a hoist from 3 levels, and had a stone mill where they stones where they ground grain with water power from Hay Creek.
It sounds like a wonderful history, certainly worth exploring independently as a separate episode. But we're here today to talk a little bit about the fire truck. And you've been in this area how long?
I was born in Geigertown.
You were born in Geigertown?
2 miles away from here.
Just a few miles away. So you've lived here your entire life?
Yes.
And today we're in your machine shop. I wasn't sure whether you called it a barn, a machine shop, but it should have been obvious looking around here. It's absolutely chock full of equipment. And your background is technical. You're a machinist. You're excellent with tools.
That's what my whole life was, a machinist. And I took apprenticeship at Birdsboro Corporation, and after I worked for 17 years as a machinist on all kinds of tremendous machines, and then the last of the 44 years I was in supervision.
Well, it was 2 years ago. I came walking down this lane. I found you back here, and I also discovered you had a wonderful fire truck. And could you give us a little bit of an overview of this 1916 fire truck, what it means to you and some of its history?
It all started because of a Dalmatian dog I had, and he was one that anything that would move, he wanted to be on it. So I figured a fire truck would be great for him. And he was, till I got it, it took 4 years to complete it. And the last 2 years that he lived, I was in parades to Birdsboro, and it got to the last that I just had to put him asleep.
What was his name?
Tigger.
So Tigger was really the inspiration for the fire engine.
And he was a Dalmatian, an exact thing for a fire truck.
All right. Now, we talked a little bit about the history of the fire truck prior to going on camera here. Could you share with those that are viewing how it was assembled, where the parts came from, how it all came into being?
Well, I started with a title from the Nagel family. I had the title of a 1916 market wagon. And that way, with a title, I could have it transferred to my name, and then I could get license to put it on the road. And after then, I started with pieces. I had a lot of the pieces of the motor and that part of it, and then from all parts of the United States, on the computer I would put in requests for parts, and like the sheet metal came from Indiana, and the pump came from Hay Creek Valley Historical Association flea market, and that was a John Beam pump, and they were famous for sprayers in their day, orchard sprayers. And after when they would have water in these wooden tank sprayers, there would be a fire around the farm, and they would hook horses up and pull it out and put the fire out with the water that was in the sprayer. So John Beam noticed that was a good way to go to expand their business. So then they got really production then of fire truck pumps, high pressure pumps.
Now, we're going to walk around and take a look at certain elements of the fire truck. A few moments ago, you shared with me some information about the bell. Traditionally, in 2012, we think of fire trucks and sirens. If you could share with us some of the history of that bell and how fire engines and the sirens and the bells and the whistles and all those warning elements were used historically versus today.
Well, back in 1916, they had sirens, but they were outlawed in town because horses never heard them before, and the horses would panic and run out of town.
So they heard the sirens and the horses were in flight, and obviously it disturbed people when that happened.
So then they started with bells on the fire trucks, and they also used bells in the firehouse too. The tremendous bell would be in the firehouse to call the firemen instead of sirens then. And the horses were used to the church bells and all bells, even bells on them, and when they traveled. And they kept putting bells on the fire trucks up till 1936.
All right, now, this may be a little bit more technical, but historically, you've got a fire truck from 1916. How common would it have been to see a truck like this responding to a fire? Was there all manner of equipment, horse-drawn wagons in that particular era?
They were mostly horse-drawn up to the beginning of the 20s, and a Model T fire truck was a lot faster than getting there with a team of horses. Back then, the fire trucks, very few Model Ts had pumps. Some had pumps on them, but very few. They mostly had them the tanks charged at the firehouse, high pressure tanks, and they would have maybe about 200 gallons of water that they could haul. And they would use, when they got to the firehouse, they already treated the water with baking soda, but then they would, to quench the fire better.
Suppressant, baking soda.
And then they would have a capsule in the dome of the tank that would dump sulfuric acid on the top and would make a tremendous pressure. And that's why they would eliminated the pump.
So they created their own pressure chemically, if you will.
Yes, chemically.
Now, if we can just step back a moment here. We've got a tank on the back of this truck here. What is its capacity? Was it typical for a vehicle of this vintage?
This tank here would have been the chemical tank.
It would have, okay.
And originally I had the brackets and that came with a fire pump with a wooden barrel was here. But there was nothing left when I would go in parades or anything, kids or anything couldn't get on it. So,
no room, okay.
So I discontinued the 50-gallon wooden tank.
Well, I want to say, as a publicly elected official, we're absolutely thrilled that you've done this historical preservation, because certainly the state has a very large and abiding interest in its history, and this is significant, and you've done a wonderful job with it back here in your machine shop. As we walk around toward the front of the fire engine here, I look at radiator, I look at lights, I look at a crank, I look at all the mechanics in the front of this fire engine. How long, how much time did it take to pull all these pieces together? You don't call Napa Auto Parts. Trying to acquire parts for a fire engine of this age and this vintage has to require an extraordinary amount of work. Can you tell us a little bit how all this came together? You shared a little bit going online. Some of it's local, some of it came from other places, perhaps even a bit about the maintenance of this part of the fire engine.
Well, the brass radiator came from Charles Keinert, a close friend of mine, and it was in restored condition when I got it. The radiator, the water is actually right next to the brass on the inside, and this, most of the time the Model T runs close to 212 degrees, and if you touch that when it's like that, it'll even lit some of your skin left on it.
Hasn't been run recently. It looks like it's safe to touch it. So it's really exposed to the elements, and as well as individuals who might approach the vehicle. So there's a cautionary note if you've run it recently and you have it around children, I would imagine.
What I had to be careful, 1916 is when they changed over to electric headlights. And the latter part of 1916, it was much easier for me to find electric lights than it would have been the carbide lights.
Okay. Of course, they'd have much more latitude running an emergency vehicle through, but as a first responder, we know you can't risk a life to save a life. What would have been the top speed of this fire engine?
This, just the way it is, 35 mile an hour is getting its limit.
Okay.
That it will want to cooperate on.
My first car, that was about the speed limit of the Corvair I originally owned, 35 miles an hour.
And with the steering, that's plenty fast enough.
Okay. So it's not power steering here.
No.
You've got to kind of muscle this thing around.
That's right. Well, and with the added weight with water, and that makes it a little bit different than a Model T that didn't have a pump and all that extra weight.
All right. You've got a crank start on it. It still crank starts. That's
You can.
You can.
Yeah.
All right. And you've got a battery as well, so you actually have a more traditional starter.
Yeah. Yes.
So there's two possible ways to start it. But in 1916, was it exclusively the crank?
It was only the crank.
It was only the crank. All right. Probably sometime here shortly, we may even ask you to consider cranking it up. But I just want to pause and look at the running board. You've got a seat here. Modern firefighters, we see lots of personnel, lots of seats. If this were running to a fire, how many people would be on the vehicle, and what would be its maximum capacity if you're going to serious fire?
It has a step on the back for three to hang on, and there's a bar for them to hold on to, and then you could have an extra one could sit next to the driver.
Okay. So you can have one next to the driver. If we'll just step a little closer here. So the running board here is to step onto the truck. It really isn't suited for people riding on the truck in an emergent situation. Or could somebody actually be hanging onto the side of the truck?
No, you wouldn't be hanging on here.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that they wouldn't, but back then they probably did some hang on short distances on the running board and hold on there. But basically, if there was any distance, it would be one would sit here and two standing and hanging on the bar in the back.
Okay, in the traditional sense, we see some hosing on the side of the truck. Is that what we would have expected to see in 1916? Hoses strapped on, much like we see hoses in a modern vehicle?
Well, one thing that's a little different here, back then they had one hose that would be looped on here all the way over the hood and back that side.
Literally coming around
yeah, most of them,
the passenger
but I
compartment
didn't
here.
do it that way. I did, which they did a little bit later, and put two separate.
Mr. Fleming, it's raining outside and it doesn't look like we're going to be able to take the fire engine out of the machine shop. But if you could do something for us, if you wouldn't mind, could we actually fire her up, get her running, and let's listen to that engine purr here for a couple moments.
Certainly.
All right, get on that running board there. And is there room up there for me to join you?
Yes.
And I'm looking down at the pedals here. Before I get on, I got 3 pedals I see down on the floor here, and it looks like there's a story behind it. If you wouldn't mind sharing that before you fire the engine up, let us know what that's all about.
Well, the pedals, you depend on your emergency brake. When you're to bring it in neutral, you pull your emergency brake back halfway, and if you want to go forward, you push the low gear pedal, one on the far left, and you bring it back in neutral, and if you want to back up, you push the center pedal, and then you can back up. And this one here, the third one over is a brake, foot brake.
It looks like
Now,
it works
when
well if you have small feet. There's not a lot of room there.
Once you've learned to drive a Model T, you can keep this front emergency brake, and you have a neutral on the low gear pedal that you can push it halfway and then push the center pedal.
Well, that's great. Thank you for that description. I'm not certain I'm ready for my driver's test yet on the 1916 fire engine, but it looks like we're going to go ahead and fire up and see what she sounds like. So we have an RPM.
No.
That's great. She sounds wonderful, and she crank starts as well as key starts.
Yes, I can crank it by hand.
I'll tell you what, I'd like to make an appointment with you in the future and actually take her out for a ride in the community, and I'm very, very pleased that you took time to visit with us in your machine shop. Thank you so much, Mr. Fleming.
You're welcome.
That's all the time we have for this program. I'm State Representative Mark Gillen. If you have any questions about what you've just seen, or if I can help you with any state-related matter, please stop by or call my district office or visit me online. That information will be on your screen in a moment. Thanks for watching, and please join me next time for Legislative Report.